see all of you here. I want to apologize to our group that went to Mountain States this last week and did such a wonderful work there. I was so intent on trying to remember what I was supposed to be speaking in the minutes that I had up there that I just went over my head. But anyway, for those of you who worked at Mountain States, I know you did a wonderful work there, and I know that they certainly did appreciate everything that you did down there. And probably they were certainly blessed, but you're probably even more so blessed because of the work that you did, and that's the way it always works when it comes to mission-type efforts. Let me also say before I get into talking about this report tonight is that this morning, I shared with you an illustration about an elderly woman and, the loneliness that she had felt. And David, even when he was in that cave, he said, no one cares for my soul. That wasn't really true. There were a lot of people who cared for David's soul. Jonathan cared for David's soul. But when you're in a place like that, or in this deep, dark place like that, it's hard to think of that. It's hard to believe that there's someone out there that cares for you. And even when it comes to this elderly woman who was going through this lonely period in her life, that was true that she was lonely there, but, she could have done some things. She could have been one of those people who reached out to others herself. She could have been that note writer. She could have been that person who was praying for other individuals. She could have been making visits. She could have, she had a lot of avenues. But when you're in that place, when you're in that hard place in your life, it's hard to see beyond your own hurt and your own pain. And so I'm saying this to you that when you're doing a 35-minute lesson or so, you're not always able to get all the balances in there. And so I just wanted to balance it a little bit out for you this evening about that part there so you could understand, or so you know that I understand that, what's going on there. So when you talk about Israel, for those of you who were not here last week, I began the report about Israel, and I talked about being in deserts and building altars and digging wells and things like that. And we basically talked about Abraham and his journeys, and we looked at Beersheba and Arad and the Dead Sea, and that's kind of where we focused around and did some biblical lessons or some spiritual lessons from that. When you talk about Israel, it's hard for us as Americans to think of Israel as a country, because when you think about Israel as a country, they're not near as big as we are as a state. I mean, they're about 35 miles wide. They're 150 miles long, and so it's not a big place, and you can travel it in a matter of just a couple of days to get around just those parts and so forth. But Israel is uniquely, I think, chosen by God out of all the places on the planet that would be a perfect place, because in its day, it was a land bridge for all the other nations. It was a land bridge for Egypt, moving up through the silk trade all the way up to China itself. It was a land bridge for those up in Mesopotamia to come down through and do trade through there. There's all these areas here that we're talking about through the Jordan Valley and so forth. Those were all, that's the Silk Road that we're talking about right here that goes up through here and then up and through Turkey and on over into China and so forth. And of course, Egypt is down here, and they also made roads up there. And so the Fertile Crescent was a place that, people of the world were well familiar with. And if you're talking about the Romans, then I've never had that do that before. Uh-oh, which way am I going here? Okay, hang on. Okay, now I know where I'm going. Here's the events recorded in the history of time. That's where I was going. Okay, you got to be careful how I hit buttons here. So when you go over here to the coastline here and you talk about Caesarea Maritima, which is somewhere around here, Caesarea Maritima was a major port that Herod the Great had built in order for Rome to come over, because even Rome knew the value of Judea and so forth. And so, Caesarea Maritima, it was such an incredible port city that the Romans, they could actually harbor over 120 Roman warships in that place. So we're talking about a big place. And so that was access even for the Roman world. And so Israel is a central place in terms of a place that would carry out God's scheme of redemption and how he was going to enter into the lives of people and bring them to himself. This evening, I want to move away from the Dead Sea and the wilderness and start going north. And as you start going north from the wilderness, the further north you go, the more greener it gets, the more lush it gets. By the time you get up to the Golan Heights, it's absolutely incredibly beautiful very fertile places, and they grow great orchards and cherries and those kinds of things. It's just an incredible place there. In between, though, there are strongholds in the wilderness, and that's what we're going to talk about this evening, the strongholds in the wilderness and trusting in God's power. So we got on our tour bus, and we took off, and we left the Dead Sea area, and we headed north, and what we're going to do is we're going to stop at Masada, we're going to stop at Qumran, at Jericho, and then eventually find ourselves in Galilee. Here, if you've been to the store and you bought pomegranate fruit and so forth, that's a pomegranate tree. Everyone's saying, boy, that's a pretty little tree. What is that tree there? And so I went over and took a picture of it and then said, that's a pomegranate tree. And I thought, okay, so that's where those little things come from and so forth. But I just thought it was kind of a nice thing for you to see. So we left the Dead Sea, and we began to go north along the Dead Sea, along the Dead Sea coast and so forth. And eventually, just before you get to the end of the Dead Sea, off to the west is a high plateau that rises almost 1,450 feet, 1,443 feet off the Dead Sea plateau up into a plateau. And on top of that plateau, there was a fortress that was there. And that's what the word Masada means. The word Masada in Hebrew is a fortress. And it's on this fortress here that Herod the Great would build a fortress and would build his palace. And so as you look at the picture of this large area here, there you will see Herod's palace here. And back here is the fortress that was built with a wall, with a Herodian wall that went all the way around the city itself, and so it became an extremely fortified place and almost an impregnable place, because there's really only one way up the mountain to it. Well, they said there were three, but the three eventually converge into one, and so there's only one way up into the fortress itself. So it is almost impregnable in all kinds of way. Well, Herod the Great, he built both the fortress and the palace, and he called it Masada, and he did it somewhere around 37 to 31 BC. The only written source that you have about Masada and its history is written by a fellow by the name of Josephus Flavius. And of course, Josephus Flavius, he was born Joseph ben Metanahu, and he was, he was of the priestly family. He was a soldier. He is eventually, he leads, he's named the governor of Galilee and so forth, or of Judea, and eventually in around 63 A.D., the Jews decide to revolt against Rome. And this guy is going to get caught up in it, and eventually he'll be captured, and some would say that he was a traitor, and others say he was a historian, but he will write the history. And as he wrote about it, he wrote about Masada itself, and he talked about all the things that went on with Masada, and it was an incredible, it's just incredible when you think about Masada. When you look at this place here, when you talk about it going from the deck, from below sea level, all of a sudden you go up almost 1,500 feet. Well, this hill almost does that. It goes just straight up like that to the top of this plateau. And you can see the fortress itself, which is right here. These are warehouses. On back here is open areas and so forth. Over here there is a synagogue. Herod, of course, was an Idumean, but his father had converted to Judaism, and so he was raised a Jew. And then the Romans, they made him the king over Judea. So he was a guy that was kind of caught in between. The Jews hated him because he really wasn't a Jew by blood. He was an Idumean. And the Romans, they used him as a tool. So they made him a king, and so he owed the Romans. And so he did the Romans' bid, but at the same time tried to keep the Jews happy with what was going on. So he was a man kind of caught between two worlds. I'm not making an excuse for Herod. That guy was a rat. Well, he was a bad guy. He was a genius in terms of architecture and engineering. He was a genius when it came to that. They said that no one built anything in Judea as did Herod. Now, they called him Herod the Great to separate him from all the other Herods that came online, but he was the greatest of them in terms of the things that he built. He built like 6 different fortresses in Judea. He built as many palaces. He built the Herodian. He built Caesarea Maritima. He built Jericho. Jericho was nothing but a rock pile until he came along and then built a palace on it. And then, of course, Masada and other places. did I say the Herodian? He built that as well. He moved a mountain when it came down to that one there, but he decided to build a fortress on it. Some said that he did it because he thought he might eventually get crosswise with the Romans, and he's going to need a place to go. So Masada, since it was only one way up into Masada, he would choose Masada, and on it, he would build this incredible palace here. The problem with everything in the wilderness is water. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, this thing is almost 1,500 feet off the deck. How did they get water up on top of there? Did they dig wells? And the answer is no. They didn't dig wells. What they did is on the northwest side of the mountain, actually right in this area right here, Herod dug 8 or 11 cisterns. Giant, huge cisterns. And what he did is he made canals that went up around the edge of it, up into the upper mountains and the plains. And when they'd have, remember me telling you that they got like 2 inches of water a year there? He set up these canals in such a way that when they would have these great rainfalls, which turned into flash floods, all this water would come down these canals and go down a canal alongside alongside this mountain here, and it would go into those cisterns and fill up those cisterns. So he always had water, and so it became an impregnable fortress because they had always access to water that was there. In this picture here, I enlarged it so that you could see the only way up into Masada, which is this road right here. And it went up there, and I thought about walking up it, but I only thought about it for like 5 seconds. Actually, today, you can't see it today, but today at the bottom there is a visitor center down here, and there is a tram that goes up here now, so you can get on a tram and ride up the tram, and you can walk down if you like. You can walk up it if you like, but there's a tram that goes off and dumps you up there, and you can see a canal that runs down along the city right here and empties into a giant cistern right over here, cisterns over here, and then of course there are cisterns that are on top of Masada, on Masada itself. And so, when you talk about Masada, you're thinking, okay, well, what does Masada have to do with us? Well, most of Masada's history is really of a secular nature. It really doesn't affect us as Christians, other than the fact is that we're able to track history. And that history has to do with Herod, because who was Herod the Great? Can you think about who Herod the Great was and what prominent he played in the life of Jesus? Yeah, he tried to kill him. That's the guy who decided, when he found out that the Messiah was born, he's the guy who decided that all infants below the age of 2 would die. And he sent soldiers to kill them. You're talking about a murderous individual that was so insecure about who he was that he, hearing upon the fact that a child was born, decided to have every child from the age of 2 down, male child, slaughtered. And so to that degree, when you hear about Masada and you hear about Herod the Great, that kind of puts you in context of who this guy is and what he is about. Well, after Herod's death, the Romans, they stationed a garrison on the top of Masada, and there they maintained it. The question would be, well, why in the world would Masada play such a prominent role, and why would they want to, have that place there? Well, they did it because they're able to control the trade routes. They're able to control the Silk Road and anything that went up and down there. And guess what they did on those roads there? They set tolls on those roads there, and they set taxes on those roads there. You didn't just go, you just didn't drive up and down the road like they do today. You had to pay a cost in order to go up those roads, and so they were able to control those roads by being on Masada. Well, Herod knew that, and the Romans knew that as well, so they stationed a garrison up there in order to keep in check those who were in the south, which is Egypt, and those that are in the north, which would be some other kind of people. After Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, the last zealots assembled on Masada. They went out up there and they took out the garrison. The civil war itself began around 63, 64 AD. It was a bloody thing. And because of that revolt, that's what eventually brought the Romans to Jerusalem and laid siege to Jerusalem and destroyed Jerusalem. They kicked every Jew in the world out of Jerusalem. Jews were not allowed to live in Jerusalem after that. And that's why so many of them went north up into Galilee and so forth. Well, they destroyed it. The the Jewish people, the zealots, they went up on top. A guy by the name of Eleazar ben Yair, he led them up on top of this hill or on top of this fortress there, and he was there for like 3 years. And they would do raids into Rome, and they would do different kinds, inflicting different kinds of casualties and different things. They were kind of like just someone who was like a spur in the side of Rome. And finally, they got fed up with it, and so they sent a general their way, a fellow by the name of Flavius Silva. And they went there, and they laid siege to Masada. They were going to take Masada. But they have a problem. And the problem is that thing is like 1,500 feet up in the air, and there's only one way up into Masada, and it's well protected, it's fortified, it has giant walls that are around it. So how are they going to get up and inside that city? Well, the Romans, they sent the 10th Legion. I don't know what you know about the 10th Legion, but the 10th Legion occupied Judea for over 300 years. For 3 centuries, the 10th Legion was there. The 10th Legion was there at the Antonia Fortress when Jesus was in the city himself. And so Ben Yair, he leads over 1,000 zealots up onto the top of Masada, and he reinforces it. The Roman legion, they laid siege, and they laid, I think maybe a half a dozen garrisons around. You can see them today when you're on top of Masada, and you look down, you can see the ruins of over here was a large garrison, and over here is another large garrison, and over here is another large garrison because they have them walled in and so forth. But they surrounded that thing. Well, when he came there, he brought alone not only the Roman army, that is Flavius Silva, but he brings well over 1,000 Jewish captives, zealots whom they have made slaves. And what they decide to do is they're going to build a ramp up the back west wall of Masada, and you can see it right here. This is the ramp. That was not there. This here used to look like that. And they took and they moved earth. And they moved the earth there, and they put up a siege wall first, and then they began to make an earthen ramp that went up to this wall here in Masada in order to breach it. Question was asked, well, okay, so why did those zealots up there, why did they just let them build? Couldn't they have thrown hot oil down on them? Couldn't they have rained rocks on them? Couldn't they have shot arrows at them? Well, yeah, they could, but guess who's building the siege ramp? Jews, fellow zealots. And so the Romans used them as human shields as they built up the ramp, and eventually after 3 to 4 months, they were able to complete the ramp. They brought the siege work in, the battering rams in, and they battered down the wall. They penetrate the wall, but when they got there was a shallow victory because Ben Yair had given an incredible speech to these people, and he said, they're not going to get us. Our end is going to be bad. Guess what the Romans did to zealots? They crucified them. They would have crucified every man and woman on that hill. And so they decided, we're going to die free men. And so they decided to commit suicide, and they decided to kill themselves as families. And eventually it would get broken down till there was a few, and they decided to choose 10 men who would kill those who survived. And of those 10 men, they would choose the lone survivor who would then kill the other 10 men, and then he himself would then commit suicide. So when they got on the top up there, what they found were people that were dead. Listen to Eleazar ben Yair's words. Since we long ago resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than God himself, who alone is the true and just Lord of mankind, the time has now come that obliges us to make that resolution true in practice. We were the very first that revolted. We were the last to fight against them. And I cannot but esteem it as a favor that God has granted us, that it is still in our power to die bravely in the state of freedom. Pretty incredible when you think about their dedication and so forth. So that is Masada. So what does Masada mean to us, other than this history? Well, numerous times when David, you remember when David was in the wilderness and so forth, and when he was running from Saul and so forth, there were times when he would go to what is called the stronghold. And almost all people, most biblical scholars, they believe that the stronghold that he's talking about is he would go to Masada. So in 1 Samuel, the 22nd chapter, verses 4 through 5, it says, "So David's parents stayed in Moab with the king during his entire time that David was living in the stronghold. One day the prophet Gad told David, 'Leave the stronghold and return to the land of Judah.' So David went to the forest of Hereth." And so they think that the stronghold that is being talked about there is Masada itself, because it was recognized as a fortress place, or something that could be fortified because of it being impregnable. 1 Samuel 24 and verse 22, "So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold." Notice what it says. They went up to the stronghold. If you were to Google stronghold, that you'll find that David employs the word stronghold numerous times, whether he's talking about the city of David, or which used to be which was once inhabited, Jebusites inhabited it at one time, and he took it from them. He would call that a stronghold. But oftentimes he spoke about it as a stronghold. But whenever it talks about Masada, it would see the stronghold, or up into the stronghold. And so it seems as though when you look in the scriptures that Masada played a prominent role in the life of David because of its military position, and how he and his men could defend themselves if need be. On Masada, what was interesting, because of the fact that Herod was the one who built it, you'll find a synagogue up there. And this is the ruins of the synagogue right here. If you were to look at this map here and so forth, well, these are all storage houses, where people lived and so forth, and then bath houses. And then up here is where this synagogue is located there. And then you're probably saying, well, what is this? This is a mikvah. So the mikvah was a cleansing, or a ritual cleansing place. And you've heard me talk about mikvahs last week. A mikvah was where the Jews, as they practiced their religion and so forth, before sometimes they'd enter into synagogue or into anything in terms of a sacrifice, they would cleanse themselves. So they'd walk in one side of the mikvah, immerse themselves, and then walk out and come out the other side of the mikvah having been cleansed. And if all you got to do is, it doesn't take much to make that bridge between a mikvah and a baptistry, because that's exactly what they look like. And there are numerous ones up there on top of Masada. So that's how Masada plays a role in terms of history that is verifiable. So we left Masada and we headed to Qumran. Qumran is still a desert place and so forth, but it's an interesting place because it's at the northern part of the Dead Sea and so forth. Qumran was the home of a Jewish sect that they were referred to as Essenes. And they were a monastic group. They were dedicated to the preservation of the Jewish life and to scriptures. And so they're monastic in that they didn't want to be tainted by the world. And so they'd separate themselves away from the world so they could live a more pure life. These people lived somewhere between the 2nd and 1st century BC. And they were dedicated to the preservation of scriptures. And so they had scriptoriums that were there. It was a place where people gathered and so forth. There was water there because there was a well system that was created and so forth. But it was a scriptorium, so it was a place of learning, a place of knowledge. And so Jews who were extremely serious about their faith, they would go to Qumran. An incredible place. Everywhere you turned at Qumran, you would find mikvahs. I mean, everywhere that you turn. And a person said, well, why is that? Well, the reason is because in those people, when they looked at the Word of God, and as they were scribing or writing the Word of God, they were serious about it. And when they would write God's name or the holy name, the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, every time they'd write that word, they would go and cleanse themselves. They'd go and do a ritual cleanse himself out, come up, and then write Yahweh. And so they did this all the time. As they prepared to scribe or to write God's word, they would cleanse themselves. They wanted to be clean in every way that was possible. So all throughout Qumran, you'll find these mikvahs or these ritual baths almost everywhere. It was here that some say the greatest find in the 20th century was found. The greatest find in the 20th century. A lot of great things happened in the 20th century, but for Christians, they say that here at this place was probably one of the greatest things, because in that Qumran is where they found 11 caves, and in these 11 caves, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls that were hidden there in jars. Bedouins lived there and were living in the caves and around that area, and the story is told about a Bedouin who came along and he took a rock and he threw it inside the cave. And when he threw it inside the cave, it didn't go doink, it went poof and broke something. So the guy walked inside to see what it was he broke, and it was a jar. And when he opened up the jar, he found scrolls in it. And what he found in these scrolls is he found scrolls in the Hebrew language of all kinds of different kinds of literature, but certainly the Word of God was found in these caves here. So you can see some of the caves that are behind me that, you know, they just look like a cave, but then when you got closer to them and looked into them, there they found these scrolls that were there. Today you can see them in the Israel Museum. You can walk in there and you can see some of them where you can just look right down to a piece of glass and actually see the scroll themselves, but most of it is around a centerpiece around, and it's a picture of the scroll, because they're trying to keep it, I guess they're trying to keep it preserved, and so light, I guess, harms these things. And so inside the caves, they found scrolls that were written on vellum, they found scrolls that were written on papyrus, they found scrolls that were written on copper, they found scrolls that were written on a lot of different kinds of a script that was there. So up until 1947, when the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm talking about the importance of it, up until the 1947 when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the oldest Hebrew text of the Old Testament was the Masoretic Aleppo Codex, which dates back to AD 935. Okay, so 2nd century, AD 935. The Dead Sea Scrolls predate the Masoretic text by almost 1,000 years. There's a reason for that, why this is so incredible. When the two were compared, they have the Masoretic text, and then they have the Dead Sea Scrolls that are separated by over 1,000 years, and they compare those. What the scholars thought they were going to find is they thought that they would find one text that looked one way and another text that looked a different way. They would use different words. They would use different syntaxes. They would be different in a lot of different kinds of ways. And what they discovered when they compared the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Masoretic text, they found that they were absolutely identical in almost every way. And not only that, they found several scrolls that incorporated the entire Old Testament itself. So the Dead Sea Scrolls consisted of over 1,100 ancient documents, which included several complete scrolls and more than 100,000 fragments, and that date back as far as the 3rd century BC up to the 1st century. So the ones that go all the way back to the 3rd century may not have been Hebrew writings in terms of the scriptures themselves, but of some kind of other secular writings that they thought it was valuable to write. So these scrolls are preserved in Jerusalem. But here's the one that I like. Here's the one I think is important for us. This silences the critics such as Muslims and Mormons who have said that the Old Testament text has been corrupted and is not well preserved. And what you find out is that it has been well preserved, that it has been well taken care of. So let's get a perspective of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If the Pentateuch was written, begins in 1446 BC, and the Old Testament ends in 400 BC when Malachi writes the last book of the Old Testament. And Jesus, he is born around 4 to 2 BC, okay? And then you have the Aleppo Codex Masoretic text that is found, that dates back to 930 or 935 AD. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered in 1947 AD. Then look where that puts the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's an incredible find that in terms of the Old Testament, the preservation of the Word of God that we have that strengthens our faith because of that. So we left Qumran after some hours there, and we head for Jericho. And Jericho, of course, is north of the Dead Sea and a perfect place to cross the Jordan River. It's a double-walled fortress city, also called the city of palm trees, because palms were all around it at one time. It's still 800 feet below sea level. So think about Jericho, 800 feet below sea level, and then Jerusalem, 27 feet above, what am I wanting to say? Sea level, yeah, okay, above sea level. Okay, so in its day, it's a good possibility that this is the way Jericho looked. A double-walled city, an impregnable city. Here is the find today. And here you can see a large cut, and generally when they start archaeological cuts, they go right through the center of things, and they begin to break down and look for the different kinds of stratas or layers that are on this, what is called a tell, where a civilization or a city is built on top of a city, which is built on top of a city, which is built on top of a city. And that's called a tell and so forth. So that is what it's like. I have to say to you that when I got to Jericho, I was so disappointed. It's probably of all the archaeological things I saw, it's probably the most disappointed because it just looked like a pile of rocks to me. So that was kind of a little bit of a bummer there. The main attraction in the modern day Jericho is within what is called the boundaries of the Palestinian authorities on the West Bank. And the site is called Tel Es Sultan. That's the ancient site of Jericho. Jericho is still there, but it's under Palestinian authority control. And so Jews really are not allowed in there. Our tour guide, which his name is Afi, when he got ready to go in, he had him stop and he got off the bus, and the bus went on into the Palestinian authorities. And they haven't done a lot of excavation on Jericho simply because, I think I told you last week, is that the Palestinians, they really don't want a lot of landmarks that shows that Israel was here, because Israel claims Judea. They claim that 35 mile by 150 mile, they claim that land, but they don't own all that land today. The Palestinian Authority owns a lot of that land today. Gaza is owned by others, and so anything that smacks of Israel having an earmark or a stamp on it, they don't want you digging in it, so they don't allow any archaeological work to go on there because of that fact. Herod the Great, he built, Jericho was destroyed numerous times, and Herod the Great built a palace there, and it became a great city once again, and it was, it was once again the city of palms. But when he died, one of his slaves, he burned the city down, and he plundered it. And then later on, the Romans would come in, and then they would rebuild up on the city. This here is the retaining walls. They're at the bottom of the city. And these are some towers that as you go up higher, you begin to see these towers that are here. Here's a tower that is here. When you first see the tower, you're up on top of this tail, and you're looking down at this tower, and you're saying, that's a tower. The thing is below me. Well, at one time, all that rock was not there, and that earth was not there. At one time, that tower rose like 80 feet off the ground. This turret, it was a turret raised almost over 80 feet off the ground from the bottom of the city on up. And so you can see it as being a fortress. And the thing you have to always remember about these archaeological things is they're oftentimes under 20, 40, hundreds of feet of dirt over the last 3,000 years or so. So this is a tower that you see here that once was there, showing the strength and the fortress of what Jericho was. This picture here is looking from the city, looking up this ravine right here. This here is a monastery here, but here we're back here, and you look across the city, and right here, this is the Jericho Road. So you're going uphill if you're going to Jerusalem. You're going downhill the other way around. It's the first city that was conquered by Israel as they entered into the Promised Land in Joshua. First city that was conquered as they crossed the Jordan. They went and they took Jericho. Jesus often visited Jericho. He made several forays down in there. There he restored sight to a blind man. It was there where Zacchaeus, that wee little man that was up in a sycamore tree, that he did not reject him, but he said, come down here, I'm going to your house today. And then says, faith has come to this man's house in that same event and so forth. Between Jericho and Jerusalem is where the Good Samaritan story occurred. So Jericho has a lot to say to us. And like I said, when you think about Jericho and you think about just the terrain itself, then here is Jericho, 825 feet. And then to go from Jericho up to Jerusalem, remember it says that the priest was going down to Jerusalem. That is, he already did his business up in Jerusalem, and now he's going down to Jericho. They're going down, and it's a huge drop that they're going down to. So all the way down from Jerusalem at 2,540 feet, all the way down to 825 feet was pretty incredible. Here's the Jericho Road right here. Pretty incredible. I mean, you would think it's going to be a road, right? Well, that doesn't look like much of a road to me, but that was the Jericho Road. And so you could see how robbers could hide in all this kind of terrain, and how when you decide to travel in Jericho, you better do it in in broad daylight, and you ought to do it with a caravan. You shouldn't go by yourself, because you could end up like that guy, and that is robbed. So there's the Jericho Road. I mean, you can see it's right there. It's a little old dinky path going up that terrain there, and then here it is again. So you're talking about some crazy terrain. So we left Jericho eventually, and we headed up to Galilee. And once we got to Galilee, we stayed at a kibbutz, and it's called the Kibbutz Genasar. You might be thinking, what is a kibbutz? Well, a kibbutz was established back in probably the early part of the 20th century, and that's where the Jews, they would come together in kind of a commune kind of place, and they would plant their orchards together, they would farm together, they'd raid herds and flocks together, and then they mutually shared the proceeds from it. They shared it with one another. And as we were talking about that, I thought, wow, that sounds a lot like the poorhouses back in the 1920s. That's back then when Shelby was alive. But the poorhouses, and in the poorhouses, in the 1920s during the Great Depressions, people lost their farms, they lost everything. And how did they make a living? And so they would go to what was called the poorhouse, state-run poorhouses. Over in the Oregon coast, how many of you have heard of McMenavins? McMenavins used to be a poorhouse. It was where those who lost everything went there, and it was kind of a hostile arrangement, where they shared dormitories and rooms, and they shared bathrooms and showers, and they shared in raising crops and herds and flocks and all that kind of, and then they mutually shared all those things. It was a kind of a community kind of effort, and that's what this kibbutz was, and that's where we stayed, which was a really nice hotel. I thought it was a nice hotel. So, so I'm done. And next week, Clint's got a report for us, and then the next week we'll talk about some of the things I saw around Galilee. So listen, here's the invitation. If you'd like to respond, you know what's on your heart. And so if you'd like to respond, now would be a good time to do it while they stand and while we sing.